My name is Sienna Clark. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my professional life, I've been described the same way: dependable, composed, and easy to overlook. I work in corporate compliance for a mid-sized tech firm in Chicago. It's the kind of role that exists to prevent disasters no one ever sees. When everything runs smoothly, no one asks who made it that way. And I've always been comfortable with that. I don't need applause. I prefer clarity, structure, quiet impact. People tend to underestimate me because I don't compete for attention. I don't interrupt in meetings. I don't dress loudly. I don't react quickly. I listen. I document. I remember. To some, that reads as passive. To others, it reads as harmless. What they don't realize is that calm is not the absence of strength. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about dramatic takedowns or shouting matches in glass conference rooms. It's about something slower, more precise. It's about what happens when someone misjudges your silence for weakness, and how quietly reclaiming your ground can change everything. Not long ago, my boss accused me of leaking confidential company files. It was a serious allegation, the kind that can end careers before lunch, the kind that spreads faster than truth ever could. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I didn't defend myself the way people expected. Instead, I asked IT to check the security logs. What followed wasn't explosive. It was surgical. The access trail didn't lead to my computer. It led to his. But this isn't just a story about being falsely accused. It's about patterns that were built long before that moment. The subtle dismissals. The roles we're assigned without consent. The quiet calculations we make to survive in rooms where we're seen as useful, but not formidable. I want to tell you exactly how it unfolded, step by step. Not to dramatize it, not to humiliate anyone, but to show how power can shift without raised voices, how dignity can be maintained without spectacle, and how sometimes the strongest move you can make is simply to let the truth speak, after you've made sure it's undeniable. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever felt the weight of being the reliable one, while others took credit, you might recognize parts of yourself in this. Have you ever realized that someone mistook your calm for compliance? Before the accusation, before the meeting with IT, before anyone questioned access logs or audit trails, I was the safe one. That's how they saw me. In every department, there's someone like that. The person who doesn't complicate things. The one who reviews contracts at 9 p.m. without being asked. The one who quietly corrects errors before they escalate. The one who absorbs tension without reflecting it back. In our company, that was me. When executives needed confirmation that a process was fine, they asked me. When someone forgot to file compliance documentation, it landed in my inbox with a casual, "Sienna, can you clean this up?" When meetings ran long and tempers edged closer to sharp, I was the neutral tone in the room. Reliable, measured, unthreatening. I don't say that with bitterness. At the time, I even took pride in it. I believed stability was a form of leadership. I believed competence would eventually speak for itself. What I didn't fully see was the quiet hierarchy forming around perception. In meetings, when I spoke, people nodded politely, but they rarely wrote anything down. 5 minutes later, a male colleague would restate my point with a slightly firmer tone, and suddenly it became a strong strategic insight. I noticed. Of course I noticed. But I didn't correct it. I told myself that alignment mattered more than credit. My boss, Daniel, often introduced me to new hires as our compliance backbone. It sounded flattering. It wasn't. A backbone isn't visible. It's structural. Essential, but hidden. He would say it with a light laugh, like it was a compliment. "Sienna keeps us out of trouble," he'd add. Never. Sienna anticipates risk better than anyone here. Never. Sienna designs the frameworks we rely on. Just keeps us out of trouble. I became the insurance policy. Quiet, present, replaceable in theory, indispensable in practice. There's a specific kind of invisibility that comes from being consistently competent. You become background infrastructure. People assume you'll manage whatever falls apart. They don't ask how much it costs you to carry it. I wasn't unhappy. That's the complicated part. I liked my work. I liked precision. I liked building systems that prevented chaos. I didn't crave the spotlight. But there's a difference between not needing attention and being denied recognition. Over time, I started noticing how decisions were made around me rather than with me. I would prepare detailed risk assessments, and Daniel would skim them, nod, and then summarize them to upper leadership without looping me in. When praise came down the chain, it stopped at his desk. Again, I told myself it didn't matter. My work was intact. My reputation was stable. I had no disciplinary marks, no complaints. In fact, I had a record of clean audits and flawless regulatory reviews. That should have made me untouchable, but I wasn't untouchable. I was underestimated, and underestimation creates a strange vulnerability. When people don't see you as a strategic mind, they also don't imagine you as a threat, which means they don't hesitate to use you as a shield. Looking back, I realized something important. The accusation didn't come out of nowhere. It came from a perception gap, from the belief that I was solid, but small. To them, I was dependable infrastructure. To myself, I was an observant architect. They saw steadiness, they did not see memory, and that distinction would eventually matter. But at that time, I was still playing the role they expected. Calm, useful, composed. A woman who would rather fix the leak than question who caused it. I didn't yet understand that one day, I would be the leak they tried to blame. If you try to trace the fracture back to its origin, you rarely find a single dramatic break. You find hairline cracks. The first one for me was almost forgettable. It happened on a Tuesday morning in early spring. We were reviewing a potential partnership with a European data vendor, one that would require careful compliance navigation due to cross-border data regulations. I had spent 2 weeks mapping out the legal exposure, highlighting exactly where we needed additional safeguards. I presented the findings in our internal strategy meeting. I was calm, concise, and clear. I even anticipated the executive objections before they surfaced. Daniel skimmed the slides on the screen and leaned back in his chair. "Thanks, Sienna," he said, in the same tone someone might use after being handed a cup of coffee. "Let's not overcomplicate this. We don't need to scare ourselves with hypotheticals." There was a soft chuckle around the table. Hypotheticals. The word landed quietly, but it stayed. I clarified, gently, that these weren't theoretical concerns. They were documented enforcement trends. I cited 2 recent cases where similar oversights had resulted in regulatory penalties. Daniel waved his hand slightly. "Right, but those companies were sloppy. We're not sloppy." And that was it. The conversation moved on. No one defended the analysis. No one asked to revisit the risk assessment. The decision to proceed was made without incorporating the safeguards I recommended. On the surface, nothing dramatic had happened. No raised voices, no direct dismissal of me personally. But something shifted inside me, because I knew something they didn't. Compliance doesn't punish arrogance. It punishes assumption. 2 months later, that same vendor triggered a minor audit inquiry. Nothing catastrophic. Just a formal request for documentation clarifications from a regulatory body overseas. We resolved it. Quietly, efficiently, using the exact contingency framework I had already prepared. Daniel thanked the team broadly in an email. Great collaborative effort resolving this so quickly. My name was in the middle of the CC list. That was the first small cut. Not because my idea had been dismissed. That happens in any workplace. But because I realized something subtle. My expertise was welcome when it prevented embarrassment, but inconvenient when it required slowing momentum. From that day forward, I started noticing patterns. When I raised concerns, they were framed as caution. When Daniel overrode them, it was framed as leadership. When outcomes validated my initial warnings, it became team resilience. I didn't confront him. I didn't escalate anything. I told myself that hierarchy comes with ego, that navigating personalities is part of professional maturity. But I began writing more detailed notes in my black leather notebook. Dates, phrases, decisions. Not out of paranoia, out of clarity. There's a difference. I didn't yet feel threatened. I still believed I was valued, even if imperfectly understood. But something inside me began recalibrating. Respect, I realized, isn't lost in a single blow. It erodes through minimization. And once someone learns they can dismiss you without consequence, it becomes a habit. That Tuesday meeting wasn't explosive. It didn't predict the accusation that would come later, but it revealed something foundational. In Daniel's mental model of the company, I was the safety net, not the strategist. And safety nets, in moments of crisis, are often blamed for not catching what leadership refuses to see. At the time, I let it go, but I did not forget it. The dangerous thing about subtle disrespect is how easily it blends into routine. After that spring meeting, nothing outwardly changed. I still had my title, my responsibilities, my steady stream of deliverables. Daniel still stopped by my desk occasionally with a polite smile and a stack of last-minute requests. On paper, I was doing well, but something quiet had shifted in how I was positioned. When senior leadership meetings were scheduled, I was sometimes told about them after they happened. Not intentionally excluded, just looped in later. When summaries were sent, they referenced compliance concerns without specifying whose analysis had shaped them. It was never direct enough to protest. That's how normalization works. Each instance was small enough to rationalize. He's busy. It wasn't personal. It's not worth making it awkward. I became very good at rationalizing. There was a quarterly review where Daniel presented a revised internal audit framework, one that looked strikingly familiar. I recognized entire sections, sentence structures, even a phrasing I tend to use when describing risk tiers. He had pulled directly from a document I drafted weeks earlier. During the presentation, he said, "I've been rethinking how we categorize exposure levels." I watched from the side of the room, expression neutral. No one questioned authorship. Why would they? He was the director. I was the analyst. Afterward, a colleague leaned toward me and whispered, "That's basically your framework, right?" I gave a small smile. It's aligned. Aligned. That word became my shield. If something resembled my work but wasn't credited, it was aligned. If my recommendations resurfaced under a different voice, they were integrated. If I was left off a strategic email thread, it was an oversight. It felt more professional to interpret things generously. The problem is, generosity without boundaries invites repetition. Over time, I noticed that Daniel relied on me heavily, but strategically distanced himself from attaching my name to decisions. When proposals succeeded, they were framed as leadership direction. When there were minor setbacks, compliance recommendations were cited as conservative constraints. I started to see the pattern. I was useful insulation. If something went wrong, it could be framed as overcautious analysis. If something went right, it was decisive leadership. Still, I stayed quiet. Why? Because silence felt efficient. Because challenging credit dynamics can brand you as difficult. Because I believed consistency would eventually correct perception. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from being both essential and invisible. You carry weight that others don't acknowledge, but you also absorb blame that isn't fully yours. And yet, I kept performing. I stayed late. I responded quickly. I built redundancies into our systems that protected not just the company, but Daniel specifically. I made sure documentation trails were airtight. I made sure risk exposure was mitigated before it reached executive eyes. I told myself this was strategic patience. But in truth, part of me still wanted approval. Still believed that if I demonstrated enough foresight, enough loyalty, and enough competence, recognition would follow naturally. I didn't see that I had already been categorized. Reliable. Contained. Safe to override. The normalization wasn't loud. It didn't humiliate me in meetings. It didn't reduce my salary or demote my role. It did something subtler. It conditioned the room to see my authority as advisory rather than essential. And once a narrative like that sets in, it becomes very easy, when pressure builds, to redirect accountability downward. At that point, I was still playing along. Still believing that professionalism meant absorbing friction quietly. I didn't know yet that my silence was being logged, not as strength, but as flexibility. And flexible people are often the first to be bent. There's a moment in any professional dynamic when you realize you're no longer just doing a job. You're performing a role. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to see mine clearly. I wasn't just the senior compliance analyst. I was the stabilizer. the quiet fixer, the one who made uncomfortable realities manageable without making anyone feel threatened. When Daniel brought me into meetings, it wasn't to advocate for my analysis. It was to validate his decisions after they were already made. He would say things like, "Sienna, you're comfortable with this approach, right?" Comfortable. As if my role was emotional reassurance rather than strategic assessment. If I hesitated, even briefly, the air in the room shifted. Not hostile, just expectant. Like I was disrupting the rhythm. So I learned to respond carefully. "I can work within that structure," I'd say. Not endorsement, no objection. Just compliance framed as flexibility. Over time, I realized something unsettling. My presence gave decisions legitimacy. My silence gave them safety. In one budget meeting, a proposed cost-cutting measure directly impacted our internal audit frequency. I knew reducing those checks increased long-term exposure. I explained the trade-offs calmly and clearly. Daniel nodded, then reframed it. "Sienna's point is that there's some theoretical risk, but we can monitor." The room relaxed. Theoretical again. I wasn't the strategist. I was the cautious voice you acknowledged before proceeding anyway. And I let it happen. Not because I lacked confidence, but because I believed influence didn't require confrontation. I believed that if I stayed steady, if I stayed indispensable, my authority would solidify naturally. Instead, something else solidified, the expectation that I would adapt. If timelines were unrealistic, I would make it work. If documentation was incomplete, I would clean it up. If leadership overpromised to clients, I would find compliance language to protect us afterward. Reliable, useful, invisible. It's strange how easily that role can become an identity. I stopped volunteering ideas that weren't directly requested. I began trimming my reports, making them sharper, shorter, less likely to be dismissed as overanalysis. I told myself I was refining communication, but really, I was compressing myself to fit the space they were comfortable giving me. There's a quiet grief in realizing you've been strategically minimized, not out of malice, but out of convenience. Daniel wasn't a cartoon villain. He wasn't cruel. He was ambitious, image-conscious, protective of his authority, and I was non-threatening. That combination created an unspoken contract. He would lead. I would reinforce. He would decide. I would stabilize. What I didn't understand then was how dangerous that contract could become. Because when pressure rises, when something goes wrong, roles matter more than truth. If I were the safety net, I could also be framed as the failure point. If I were the quiet system expert, I could be accused of mishandling the system. And the most dangerous part? I had built so much of the internal documentation infrastructure myself that very few people truly understood it without me. Which meant two things. I was essential, and I was easy to blame. I still hadn't imagined an accusation. I still believed the professional ecosystem we operated in was fundamentally rational. But the role had already been assigned. And once a room decides who you are, it rarely questions that identity, until it becomes inconvenient. The shift didn't happen during the accusation. It happened weeks before that, on a day that felt almost forgettable. It was late, nearly 7:30 p.m. The office had that hollow, after-hours stillness where the hum of fluorescent lights becomes louder than conversation. Most of the floor was empty. I was finishing a compliance reconciliation for a client contract Daniel had fast-tracked. He had promised delivery before fully reviewing the regulatory attachments. I had stayed to make sure nothing slipped through. As I compiled the final documentation, I noticed something small. A permissions update in our internal file sharing system. A change in access rights for a restricted compliance folder, the one that housed confidential audit materials and vendor risk assessments. The change had been authorized earlier that week. By Daniel. That wasn't inherently suspicious. Directors often require access, but the adjustment expanded permissions beyond what was standard protocol. It allowed remote export without dual authentication. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. It wasn't a violation, yet. It was a deviation. I checked the timestamp. It had been made outside regular hours. Again, not illegal, just irregular. For a moment, I considered sending a quick message. "Hey, I noticed the permission expansion, just confirming intended use?" But I didn't. Instead, I documented it in my notebook. Date, time, file path, authorization record. Not because I distrusted him, because I had learned something over the past year. Deviations become narratives later. I closed my laptop and sat there in the quiet. That was when the internal shift happened. Not anger, not fear. Clarity. For the first time, I allowed myself to step outside the role I'd been playing. I imagined what would happen if something went wrong, if sensitive files were mishandled, if regulators questioned data movement. Who would be asked about system oversight? Me. Who managed compliance architecture? Me. Who had the quiet reputation of keeping us out of trouble? Me. And who had just authorized expanded access? Not me. It was the first time I fully understood the asymmetry. I had been protecting the structure that did not equally protect me. The realization wasn't dramatic. It was almost clinical, like identifying a design flaw in a system you built yourself. I drove home that night without music, just the low sound of traffic and my own thoughts aligning into something steadier than frustration. Up until then, my silence had been adaptive. From that night forward, it became deliberate. I didn't confront Daniel the next day. I didn't escalate the permissions issue. I didn't warn anyone. I simply began observing differently. I tightened documentation trails. I archived communication threads more meticulously. I requested written confirmations where verbal approvals used to suffice. When Daniel stopped by my desk with a quick directive, I followed up with a polite summary email, just confirming our approach for record clarity. He never objected. Why would he? It looked like thoroughness. But internally, something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer operating under the assumption that loyalty would be reciprocated by default. I was operating under the principle that systems outlast personalities. And if a system failed, I would not be its silent scapegoat. The accusation hadn't happened yet, but the groundwork for surviving it had quietly begun. After that evening, I didn't change my tone. I changed my posture. Not physically, strategically. From the outside, I was the same Sienna. Calm in meetings, responsive to emails, methodical in reports. If anything, I seemed even more composed. Daniel continued relying on me, perhaps sensing my steadiness as reassurance. What he didn't see was that my silence had stopped being reflexive. It had become intentional. There's a difference between staying quiet because you feel small and staying quiet because you're observing. In meetings, I began speaking less, but writing more. When decisions were made quickly, I documented the rationale and circulated it for confirmation. When timelines were compressed beyond reason, I asked clarifying questions in writing, just to align expectations. So we have a clear audit trail. For transparency, neutral language, unthreatening. No one objected, but I was building something. Not a case, not a trap, a perimeter. Daniel occasionally teased me about my paper trail tendencies. You and your documentation, he said once, half smiling. You'd survive any audit. That comment stayed with me. Yes, I would, because I understood something he didn't. When things unravel, the calmest person in the room is usually the one who prepared quietly. My silence was no longer compliance. It was data collection. I paid closer attention to who had access to what, to which departments bypassed protocol. To what extent did Daniel make executive decisions verbally and then retrofitted documentation later? I noticed small inconsistencies. A file accessed outside typical hours. A version history that skipped standard approval steps. A forwarded attachment without proper encryption. None of it is catastrophic, but patterns rarely begin catastrophically. There were moments when I could have spoken up more forcefully, could have insisted on tighter adherence, could have challenged Daniel in a meeting when he downplayed a risk assessment. Instead, I chose stillness, not out of fear, out of calibration, because I understood now that if I positioned myself as oppositional, I would be framed as obstructive. If I remained composed and procedural, I remained credible. Silence, when paired with documentation, is not a weakness. It's leverage deferred. Others misread it. I could see that. A colleague once told me, "You're too easygoing. If that were me, I'd push back harder." I smiled. Pushing back loudly shifts attention to the ego. Staying steady shifts attention to evidence. And evidence, when necessary, speaks clearly. The irony is that Daniel seemed more comfortable around me during this phase. Perhaps because I no longer tried to assert intellectual ownership in subtle ways. I stopped correcting him when he paraphrased my frameworks. I stopped reminding him when a decision echoed my prior recommendations. I let him believe the dynamic was stable. Meanwhile, I was stabilizing myself. I backed up key compliance files onto secure internal archives. Standard practice. But now double-checked personally. I confirmed access hierarchies with IT under the guise of routine governance review. No alarms were raised, because I wasn't accusing anyone of anything. I was simply ensuring that if anything ever needed to be verified, it could be. When you're underestimated, people rarely imagine you preparing. They assume your quiet is permanent, but quiet can be transitional, and mine was evolving. By the time the accusation came, I wasn't shocked. I was ready. Preparation doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like routine. That was my advantage. No one noticed that I began arriving 20 minutes earlier than usual. The office was nearly empty at that hour. IT staff would sometimes be in before everyone else, running overnight system checks. I'd greet them casually, ask light questions about back-end updates, and listen more than I spoke. I've always believed that real infrastructure knowledge doesn't sit in executive offices. It sits with the people who maintain systems quietly. Over coffee one morning, I asked Adrian from IT about file access logs, purely from a governance perspective. How long do we retain detailed user activity records? I asked. 90 days fully detailed, he replied. After that, it's a compressed archive unless flagged. Is there a way to generate a comprehensive export if needed? Of course, he said. Why? Routine compliance review, I answered smoothly. Just making sure we understand our retention windows. He nodded. It wasn't unusual for me to ask. Compliance and IT intersect constantly. I made a note in my black leather notebook. 90 days. That number anchored itself in my mind. I also began revisiting old email threads. Not obsessively, just methodically. Confirming that approvals were clearly attributed, that my written confirmations existed. That was when I had flagged deviations. It was documented. The more I reviewed, the clearer the pattern became. Daniel often approved riskier shortcuts verbally, then summarized them later in softer language. He rarely left direct digital fingerprints of urgency, only reinterpretations. Except for one thing, access permissions. Those were always logged automatically. System trails are impartial. They don't rewrite tone. Around that time, rumors began circulating about a potential internal restructuring. Nothing official, just murmurs. Leadership was under pressure to cut costs. Our company had recently expanded aggressively. When expansion slows, scrutiny increases. And scrutiny looks for accountability. I felt the air shift subtly across departments. Meetings became shorter. Emails sharper. Executive leadership requested more frequent reporting from directors. One afternoon, Daniel stopped by my desk. Make sure all compliance documentation is airtight, he said casually. We might have a board review next quarter. It already is, I replied evenly. But I'll run another internal audit, he smiled. That's why we have you. The phrasing was familiar. That's why we have you. In that sentence was both validation and insulation. That evening, I did something slightly outside my usual routine. I requested from IT a standard system-wide access audit report for our department, again framed as quarterly governance hygiene. It wasn't targeted. It was comprehensive. Adrian sent it over without hesitation. Hundreds of entries, timestamps, user IDs, file paths. I didn't search for wrongdoing. I searched for patterns. Repeated after-hours access to sensitive folders. Export activity. Permission modifications. One username appeared more frequently than expected. Daniel's. Not constantly, not dramatically, but enough to form a contour. Late evenings. Weekend logins. Expanded folder access to compliance archives, which he typically didn't need day-to-day. Still, nothing illegal. But irregularity accumulates weight over time. What no one noticed was that I wasn't emotionally reacting to any of this. I wasn't building resentment. I wasn't waiting for a confrontation. I was calibrating, because I sensed something approaching, not from intuition alone, but from behavioral shifts. Daniel had grown slightly distant in meetings, less conversational, more directive, as if carrying pressure he wasn't naming. And in organizations under pressure, the narrative of control matters. If something were to surface, missing files, leaked data, compliance gaps, who would be positioned closest to system oversight? Me. They never noticed that while I remained the same on the surface, Internally, I had shifted from participant to observer, from stabilizer to strategist. They never noticed that I now understood the architecture of accountability better than anyone in that building. And most importantly, they never noticed that if a story were ever told about access to confidential files, the system itself already knew the truth. It was only a matter of timing. The accusation didn't begin with shouting. It began with a meeting invite. Subject line, urgent, compliance review discussion. It was scheduled for 9 a.m. The attendees were Daniel, someone from HR, and our internal legal counsel. When I saw the list, I felt something settle, not spike. Pressure clarifies more than it destabilizes. I walked into the conference room carrying my black leather notebook, as always. Daniel avoided direct eye contact at first. HR sat upright, with a neutral expression. Legal looked procedural. Daniel spoke first. There's been a concern raised regarding unauthorized access and possible external sharing of confidential vendor audit files, he said. His tone was controlled, but I recognized the subtle tension underneath. He paused. The activity appears to be associated with your credentials. There it was. Not a question. An implication. I didn't react immediately. I let the silence breathe. What specific activity? I asked calmly. He slid a printed summary across the table. A partial log. A timestamp. A file path. My username is listed as having accessed and exported documents late one evening. The evening matched a date I remembered clearly. The night I had stayed late reconciling the vendor contract. I scanned the sheet carefully. This log shows access, I said evenly. It doesn't show external transmission. Legal nodded slightly. We're still investigating. Daniel leaned forward. Sienna, these files were found referenced in an external inquiry. We need to understand how they left our system. Left our system. The phrasing was deliberate. For a brief moment, I felt the weight of how easily narratives solidify. I was the compliance gatekeeper. If something escaped, proximity alone made me plausible. But I also felt something else. Certainty. Because I knew something they didn't know I knew. I'd like IT to run the full access trail, I said calmly. Not a summary. The complete security logs for the past 90 days. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. We already reviewed the relevant period. With respect, I replied, voice steady. A partial extract doesn't establish a transmission path. If there's an allegation of external leak, we need export logs, IP addresses, and device mapping. Otherwise, we're speculating. The room grew still. Legal looked at Daniel. HR looked at legal. This wasn't defensiveness. It was a procedure. I welcome a full review, I continued. Please include administrative permission changes and after-hours access across all senior staff. If we're identifying a breach, we should identify it comprehensively. Daniel's eyes flickered for half a second. There's a particular silence that happens when someone realizes the terrain isn't as simple as they thought. The meeting ended without resolution. IT was instructed to conduct a deeper audit. I returned to my desk without outward reaction. A colleague glanced at me curiously, sensing tension. You okay? She whispered. I'm fine, I said. And I was, because the accusation had forced visibility. 2 days later, Adrian from IT called me. Not privately, but formally. He was instructed to compile a comprehensive activity report for legal. I think you'll want to see this, he said carefully. He didn't send it to me directly. That would have been inappropriate. But the final review meeting included me. We gathered again. Same room, same chairs. Legal opened the report. The detailed logs were projected onto the screen. Yes, my credentials had accessed the files that evening. But there was more. An administrative override had occurred 30 minutes after I left the office. A remote login from Daniel's credentials. Export authorization initiated from his device. The access trail didn't end at my workstation. It continued, and it led directly to his. No drama filled the room. No one gasped. But something irreversible shifted. The system had spoken. I didn't look at Daniel. I didn't need to. There is a unique calm that comes when truth requires no embellishment. I hadn't defended myself emotionally. I had requested verification, and verification had answered. Privately, I understood the full weight of what had just happened. The leverage wasn't explosive. It was structural, and now everyone in that room knew it. When truth surfaces, people imagine it feels triumphant. It doesn't. It feels quiet. After the full access report was displayed, the meeting ended with restrained professionalism. Legal stated that further internal review would occur. HR maintained composure. Daniel said very little. No apology, no acknowledgement, just process. I returned to my desk as if nothing seismic had shifted. But internally, everything had. Because now I stood at a crossroads. There were multiple paths available to me. I could escalate immediately, file a formal complaint about a false accusation, document reputational damage, involve executive leadership. The logs were clear enough to protect me. I could also resign, exit cleanly, preserve dignity without entanglement. Or I could stay. Staying wasn't about loyalty anymore. It was about leverage. I understood something crucial in that moment. Daniel hadn't necessarily intended to frame me maliciously. More likely, he had authorized exports under pressure, perhaps to provide documentation externally without following proper channels. When scrutiny arose, proximity made me a convenient focal point. It wasn't cartoon villainy. It was self-preservation gone careless. But carelessness at that level can end careers beneath it. And he had chosen to let suspicion land on me first. That choice mattered. Over the next few days, the office atmosphere shifted subtly. Daniel avoided one-on-one conversations unless necessary. Emails became shorter, meetings more procedural. I responded with the same calm professionalism I had always shown. No sarcasm, no distance, no visible resentment. This unsettled him more than anger would have, because anger creates symmetry. It gives the other person something to react against. Calm creates asymmetry. In private, legal scheduled a follow-up with me. They clarified that the investigation found no evidence of external transmission from my credentials beyond standard internal activity. No apology, just a conclusion. We consider the matter resolved, they said. Resolved. But resolution without acknowledgement leaves residue. I didn't demand anything in that meeting. I didn't request written exoneration. I didn't threaten escalation. Instead, I asked one question. Will the final internal report reflect the full access chain? Legal paused. Yes, that was enough. Because documentation is memory inside organizations. And memory, once recorded, alters power dynamics permanently. I went home that night and sat with the decision again. Escalate, exit, or reposition. I chose the irreversible option, not revenge. Repositioning. I scheduled a meeting with executive leadership, not to report to Daniel directly, but to present a proposal. Restructuring compliance to report independently rather than under operations. Framed as governance optimization, not a personal grievance. Strategic realignment. I used neutral language. Industry best practices. Separation of oversight from operational authority. Risk mitigation logic. They listened carefully. Because now my credibility was not abstract. It was proven under scrutiny. The system had tested me, and I had remained intact. The decision to move compliance out from under Daniel's direct supervision would not happen overnight. But the conversation had begun. That was the irreversible step. Once the governance structure shifts, authority shifts with it, and no one could undo the access logs that justified the need for separation. I didn't need confrontation. I needed architecture. And architecture, once redesigned, changes everything quietly. Structural change doesn't happen in dramatic bursts. It happens in drafts, in proposals, in carefully worded summaries that don't mention names, but make implications unavoidable. After my initial meeting with executive leadership, I didn't follow up aggressively. I didn't send reminders or press urgency. I understood something important. When a board senses governance vulnerability, it moves carefully, but it does move. My role was to remain steady. I prepared a formal governance optimization brief. 15 pages. Neutral tone. Data-backed. I cited industry standards recommending independent compliance reporting lines to avoid operational conflicts of interest. I did not reference the recent investigation directly. I didn't need to. The timing spoke for itself. I included anonymized case studies from other firms where a lack of structural separation led to regulatory exposure. I detailed risk scenarios. I mapped reporting alternatives. I provided cost-neutral transition models. In short, I made it easy for leadership to say yes. While that document circulated, I continued working under Daniel as if nothing had shifted. I responded to his emails promptly. I attended meetings. I delivered reports. He seemed cautious around me now, measured. There was no hostility, only an awareness that something invisible had changed. One afternoon, he closed my office door. "I want to clear the air," he said. His tone was restrained, controlled. I never intended for that situation to escalate the way it did. I met his gaze calmly. Intent and impact aren't always aligned. A pause. "I trust you," he added. I let that statement sit. "Trust is supported by structure," I replied gently. "Clear systems prevent misunderstandings." He nodded slowly. He understood what I was saying without me accusing him of anything directly. This was not a battle. It was a redefinition. Meanwhile, legal requested my input on revising internal access protocols. I provided it thoroughly. Two-factor enforcement for administrative exports. Automatic alerts for permission expansions. Quarterly audit transparency reports. If compliance was going to be questioned, it would become unassailable. Weeks passed. Then came the formal announcement. Effective next quarter, the compliance function would report directly to the Chief Risk Officer, independent of operations. The email framed it as strategic alignment in preparation for future growth. No mention of investigations, no mention of accusations. But everyone who needed to understand, understood. Daniel sent me a brief message after the announcement. "Congratulations on the expanded scope. Professional. Polite." I responded in kind, looking forward to strengthening governance across teams. No triumph, no undertone, just transition. What struck me most during that period wasn't relief. It was stillness. I hadn't attacked him. I hadn't exposed him publicly. I hadn't humiliated anyone. I had simply ensured that the system no longer allowed ambiguity around oversight. Power shifted quietly, not because I raised my voice, but because I asked for verification, and then redesigned the architecture that made the accusation possible in the first place. From the outside, it looked like organizational growth. From the inside, it was insulation reclaimed, and the consequences of that shift were only beginning to unfold. The announcement about compliance restructuring was framed as a strategic evolution. But in offices, consequences don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves in behavior. Within weeks of the reporting change, subtle tremors began moving through operations. Nothing dramatic, no public reprimands, no visible demotions. But influence recalibrates when oversight separates from authority. Daniel no longer had quiet control over compliance narratives. Requests for exceptions are now required to have formal documentation routed through my new reporting line. Shortcuts that once passed through hallway conversations had to be justified in writing. I didn't enforce this aggressively. I simply followed protocol. And protocol, when applied consistently, feels very different to people accustomed to flexibility. In meetings, I noticed Daniel speaking more cautiously. He no longer summarized compliance risk on my behalf. When regulatory questions surfaced, he deferred directly. "Sienna, what's your view?" It was the same room. But the posture had changed. Colleagues began looping me into strategic conversations earlier. Not because I demanded it, but because structure required it. The Chief Risk Officer scheduled quarterly direct reviews with me, independent of Daniel's input. That independence shifted perception. I wasn't just keeping us out of trouble anymore. I was part of governance architecture, and Daniel felt it. Not hostility, not resentment, loss. He lost insulation. Before, he could reinterpret compliance analysis before it reached executives. Now, my reports traveled directly upward. If a risk was flagged, it was flagged in my voice, without filtration. He had to operate cleaner. To his credit, he adapted professionally. He tightened his own documentation, reduced informal overrides, stopped expanding access permissions casually. But something intangible had shifted between us. Trust, once cracked, doesn't disappear. It becomes formal. Our conversations became more measured, more precise, less conversational. And across the department, people began noticing something else. When accountability flows upward clearly, ambiguity decreases. Fewer rushed approvals. Fewer late-night, "Can you just make this work?" messages. Compliance was no longer reactive. It was positioned as a preventive authority. The irony wasn't lost on me. The accusation meant to question my integrity had strengthened my institutional standing. Not because I fought back, because I requested transparency. I heard through quiet channels that executive leadership had expressed concern about operational risk culture. No names attached, just general language. But language shapes perception. Daniel wasn't publicly blamed. There was no disciplinary memo that I saw. However, his influence over certain strategic approvals gradually narrowed. When restructuring discussions expanded months later, his portfolio was adjusted. A few oversight functions were redistributed. Again, no announcement of cause, just organizational refinement. That's how consequences move in professional environments. Not loudly, structurally. One afternoon, as I passed his office, I saw him reviewing documents alone. His posture slightly more guarded than I remembered. Not defeated, just recalibrating. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt something closer to equilibrium, because this was never about watching him fall. It was about ensuring I could not be positioned beneath him as collateral. And once that possibility disappeared, so did the imbalance. But consequences rarely stop at structural change. They linger, they reshape relationships, and eventually, they force acknowledgement, even without confrontation. That moment was still ahead. There's a particular tension that lingers after power shifts. It's not explosive, it's not dramatic, it's quiet awareness. By the time compliance officially reported to the chief risk officer, the organizational narrative had already adjusted. People no longer saw me as Daniel's stabilizer. They saw me as structural oversight. That distinction is subtle, but permanent. Daniel tried in small ways to restore familiarity. He invited me to informal strategy lunches again. Reintroduced a lighter tone in meetings. Once, he even referenced an old framework we had built together, this time explicitly crediting me. "I think Sienna originally designed that model," he said. The room nodded. Recognition had arrived, but timing matters. Respect given after exposure feels different than respect given freely. I acknowledged it politely. It was a team effort, professional, neutral. There was no animosity in me, but there was distance. Trust, once broken by accusation, even implied accusation, doesn't fully regenerate under the same structure. It reconfigures. Weeks later, I learned through legal that the board had quietly reviewed internal access governance as part of routine oversight. The investigation findings were summarized, not sensationally, but factually. Expanded permissions, unauthorized export from an operational device, procedural lapse, no names in the broad report, but accountability doesn't require headlines. Daniel's next annual performance review reportedly included risk judgment recalibration as a developmental area. That phrase circulated quietly among leadership. Risk judgment recalibration, corporate language for, "you miscalculated." I don't know whether he understood the full weight of how close the situation had come to reputational damage for both of us. But I do know this. Had the logs been incomplete, had I not documented permissions earlier, had I reacted emotionally instead of procedurally, the narrative could have solidified differently. And once narratives harden, they're nearly impossible to reverse. One afternoon, Daniel requested a private conversation. His office felt smaller than I remembered. "I owe you something," he said carefully. I waited. I handled that situation poorly. I was under pressure, and I defaulted to proximity instead of verification. It wasn't a dramatic apology. No emotional display, just controlled acknowledgement. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied. He nodded. "The restructuring, it's probably for the best." There it was. Acceptance, not defeat. Recognition. But here's the truth. By the time apologies arrive, systems have already adapted. Even if he wanted to restore the old dynamic, he couldn't. The reporting line had changed. Governance was formalized. Transparency protocols were strengthened. Too late to fix it. Not because I punished him, because structure had replaced assumption. I left his office feeling steady, not victorious. Some consequences are educational, others are architectural. This one was both. And while the visible conflict had ended, something deeper had resolved inside me. I would never again allow proximity to power to define my vulnerability. Silence would never again mean surrender, and documentation would always outlast accusation. But one final moment remained, one that required no escalation, no report, no restructure, just clarity. The final confrontation didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened in a hallway, late afternoon, soft light through the glass panels. Most of the floor was already thinning out as people left for the day. Daniel stepped out of his office as I was gathering my bag. "Sienna," he said quietly, "do you have a minute?" There was no tension in his voice this time, just intention. We stood near the window overlooking the city. No audience, No legal counsel. No HR. Just two professionals who had crossed an invisible line months earlier. "I've been thinking about what happened," he began. "About how quickly I assumed." He didn't say blamed. He didn't say accused. Assumed. "I understand pressure," I replied. "But assumption in leadership has weight." He nodded. "I was trying to contain fallout. I thought if I moved quickly, I could control the narrative. And instead," I said evenly, "the narrative controlled you." There was no sharpness in my tone, just observation. He exhaled slowly. "You didn't fight me. You didn't escalate publicly. I'm still trying to understand why." That question mattered, because many people equate strength with visible retaliation. "I didn't need to fight," I said. "The system records truth better than emotion does." Silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable, just reflective. "I underestimated you," he said finally. There it was. Not my intelligence. Not my loyalty. My scope. "Most people did," I answered softly. He looked at me carefully. "You could have pushed for more consequences." "I wasn't interested in consequences," I replied. "I was interested in insulation." He studied that word. Insulation. Protection without aggression. "I hope we can rebuild professional trust," he said. "We already have," I answered. "It just looks different now." And it did. We weren't adversaries. We weren't allies in the same way either. We were professionals operating under clearer boundaries. There was no handshake, no dramatic reconciliation, just mutual understanding. As I walked toward the elevator, I felt something settle fully for the first time. The confrontation wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about proving myself unshakable. Not loud, not reactive, just anchored. The difference between dominance and control is temperature. Control demands noise. Dominance remains calm. And in that hallway, without raised voices or public spectacle, something irreversible crystallized. He no longer saw me as infrastructure. He saw me as architecture. And architecture doesn't bend easily. If you met me today, you wouldn't see a dramatic transformation. I still carry the same black leather notebook. I still arrive early. I still speak calmly in meetings. But something fundamental has shifted in how I inhabit the room. I no longer shrink my analysis to fit someone else's comfort. I no longer soften risk language to avoid appearing overcautious. I no longer interpret dismissal as something I need to absorb quietly. Not because I'm louder, because I'm anchored. Compliance now reports directly to the chief risk officer. My role expanded. My visibility increased. But what changed most wasn't my title. It was my internal calibration. When I speak, I don't rush to justify my expertise. I state it. When I flag risk, I don't cushion it with unnecessary disclaimers. I let clarity stand on its own. Interestingly, people respond differently. The same tone that once read as gentle now reads as authoritative. The same stillness that once felt invisible now feels intentional. What changed? Not my volume, my positioning. I stopped behaving like a support structure and started operating like strategic infrastructure. Daniel and I work professionally, cordially. There's mutual respect now. Not because we repaired the past emotionally, but because the system clarified roles objectively. He no longer filters my reports. He no longer interprets my assessments before they reach leadership. If there's a disagreement, it's documented and discussed openly. That transparency protects both of us, and I've learned something about power in the process. Power doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't require domination. It doesn't need humiliation to feel secure. True power is procedural. It's knowing that if your integrity is questioned, you can invite verification without fear. It's understanding that silence is only a weakness when it lacks awareness. It's recognizing that sometimes the most effective response to an accusation is not defense, but audit. I don't feel triumphant about what happened. I don't replay the moment the access trail appeared on the screen. What stays with me is something quieter. The calm I felt when I asked for the full logs. Because in that moment, I wasn't reacting. I was aligned with my work, with documentation, with truth. And alignment removes panic. I used to believe that being underestimated was a professional inconvenience. Now I understand it can be strategic camouflage. If you remain observant, the woman who once compressed her expertise to fit someone else's narrative is gone. Not replaced by someone louder, replaced by someone clearer. I don't need to be the backbone anymore. I am part of the visible framework. And frameworks don't apologize for existing. They simply hold. When people hear this story, they often expect a dramatic ending, a resignation, a public apology, a visible downfall. None of that happened. What happened was quieter, and in many ways more lasting. An accusation was made, verification was requested, structure was redesigned, and the truth remained intact. If there's a lesson here, it isn't about catching someone in a mistake. It isn't about waiting for your moment to expose them. It's about understanding that integrity paired with documentation is a form of quiet dominance. You don't have to raise your voice to protect your reputation. You don't have to humiliate someone to correct an imbalance. You don't have to react emotionally when systems can respond objectively. The day I asked IT to check the full security logs, I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to clarify, and clarification is powerful. The access trail didn't lead to my computer, it led to his. But the real shift wasn't that discovery. It was what I did next. I didn't weaponize it, I formalized it. Because the strongest response to being underestimated isn't revenge, it's architecture. If you've ever been in a position where your calm was mistaken for compliance, where your competence was used but not fully acknowledged, I hope this reminds you of something. Silence is only surrender if you're not paying attention. Otherwise, it's a strategy. So I'll leave you with this. If someone questioned your integrity tomorrow, would you panic? Or would you invite the audit? I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments.
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ câu chuyện mới nhất. Hẹn gặp lại.